Is the Senate in a quorum call?
No.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, I've come tonight to the floor to talk about fiscal responsibility and how important it is that we preserve or at least advance a structure in which we engage with integrity in budgeting so we don't run up massive debts that affect the opportunities for the generation to come. One of the things I've been very aware of during the 17 years I've been here is that I hear a lot of conversation from my colleagues across the aisle about fiscal responsibility. But let's be clear. The majority of the debt run up over the last 20 years has come from the Republican side of the aisle. It's been the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. Those alone account for $8 trillion. And if we turn the clock back just a little bit more, we had the 2001 Bush tax cuts, the 2003 Bush tax cuts, the 2017 Trump tax cut, each of them producing an ocean of red ink by cutting taxes for the richest Americans. Is that any way to run a country? Cutting programs for families to fund tax breaks for mega millionaires and billionaires? Well, apparently, and in the process, massive debt. Now, my Republican colleagues have engaged repeatedly in this myth that somehow the tax breaks for billionaires will result in so much increase in revenue because the economy will hum along. And every single time, it's a lie. It's a deception. It never happens. Instead, revenue plummets, and we indebt our country far into the future. Let's look at another version of the world. Every time there is a Republican administration, if you look at the first year compared to the last year, deficits go up. And every time there's a Democratic administration, first year to the last year, deficits go down. And here we are at another moment where we are about to make a decision related to another Republican bill that will create another Red Sea of debt. Some $3+ trillion over 10 years. Some $30+ trillion of debt compared to current law over 30 years. Now, the very fact that I'm mentioning 30 years points out to something new and different being put forward by my Republican colleagues. That is that under reconciliation, you've only been allowed under the rules in law, under Section 313 of the Budget Act, to incur deficits in the first 10 years, but not after the first 10 years. So there was no need for a 30-year estimate because that simply was not allowed. And as long as we're looking at what's been allowed under the law and how things have changed, let's look at the structure of what happened to the fairly magnificent 1974 Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And why do I say magnificent? Because all 100 senators, everyone on the blue side of the aisle, everyone on the right side of the aisle, said we have to get the deficits under control. 1974. Well, what had the deficits been in the 3 years before? In 1971, 72, 73, they averaged $20 billion. $20 billion. Now our deficits are about $2 trillion a year. But back then, there was seriousness about getting the budget under control. So this Budget Control Act had some interesting features. First, it had a process for regular budgeting, and then it had a separate, very special track called reconciliation, and reconciliation was designed only for reducing deficits. That's why all 100 senators voted to create a filibuster-free fast track only to reduce deficits. Picture Robert Byrd of West Virginia, one of the fiercest defenders of the filibuster. But even he voted for this special filibuster-free path only for reducing deficits, 1974. That act also produced the Congressional Budget Office, because another piece of the vision was, let's have honesty in numbers. You know, every time we come to a budget, one team or the other, whoever's in charge, kind of uses some smoke and mirrors to pretend that its impact on the budget is more favorable than it really is. So we need an organization that's impartial, nonpartisan, that will do the modeling and give us the best information for us to be able to understand the consequences of the provisions in law we're proposing. Well, that was 1974 that all of that was done. And for 22 years that followed, that filibuster-free fast track, that special reconciliation fast track, was only used for deficit reduction, because that's what it was created for. But in 1996, my Republican colleagues had the majority in the House and the majority in the Senate, and they undertook some bold new initiatives. One of those was to do a line-item veto for the president. And guess what? The Supreme Court struck that down because the Constitution says it's the responsibility of Congress, not the President of the United States of America, to lay out the decisions about how much is going to be spent on what programs. The executive executes the law, but we here write the law. So the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You want to cut a program, you can't ask the president to do that, you have to do it yourselves. And then there was a second initiative. And that second initiative was called the Balanced Budget Amendment. And the idea was that we would put a new clause in the Constitution that essentially forced us to do, much like a state government does, you have to balance the budget. Well, there were those on the Appropriations and Revenue Committee that said, I don't know that that's the right idea, because in a time of crisis, you need to be able to spend more for national security. Or in a time of recession or depression, you might need to spend more to stimulate the economy. Well, that amendment needed 2/3 vote, 67 votes here in the Senate. It got 66. So it did not pass the Senate of the United States of America. And so the Republicans at the time, Robert Dole was the majority leader, said, well, you know what we want to do? We want to do a massive tax bill with lots of provisions that cut taxes for the richest Americans. And then they said, but you know, the problem is we'll need 60 votes to move that bill off the floor, and the Democrats are not going to agree to a plan that gives away the treasury to the richest Americans. And so they concocted a plan. They replaced the parliamentarian. They replaced the parliamentarian in order to get a ruling that said the filibuster-free track, voted by 100 senators only for deficit reduction, could be used to increase deficits for tax reductions. Wow. My Republican colleagues who were preaching fiscal responsibility destroyed this powerful mechanism that all 100 senators had agreed to invoke fiscal responsibility and reduce deficits. But out of that carnage of 1996, that nuclear option, if you will, came two surviving pieces. And one of those surviving pieces was that any year after the first 10 years. In any title, you had to have deficit reductions or deficit neutrality. So whereas the deficit could be increased in the first 10 years, it couldn't be increased in any title in any year following. So you couldn't even say, well, a surplus in 2011 adjusts for a deficit, or the 11th year adjusts for a deficit in the 12th year. No, every single year, every single title, deficit neutral. And the other thing that survived was keeping honest numbers. Honest numbers. That we were going to do what Section 313 of the law says. Section 313 says each provision has to be evaluated in terms of its outlays, that's the spending impact, or the revenue impact. So here is a clause in the proposed law. If we follow that clause, if we enact that law, how will it affect spending? And how will it affect revenue? Well, each and every clause has to be costed out in that fashion. A combination of work by the Joint Committee on Taxation on the revenue side and the Congressional Budget Office on the program side, every clause. If the clause in the law, the provision in the law passes, how will it affect things? If it's not in the law, what happens? What's the difference between that? What is the difference between this new proposal and existing law? Okay. Well, now, my Republican colleagues, the party that blew up the deficit-reducing pathway, all 100 senators agreed to for the first 10 years, want to blow up the remaining two pillars. Now they want to be able to produce deficits after the first 10 years. That's why CBO is doing a 30-year estimate of the debt created by their bill. No longer is it just a 10-year framework. That 10-year framework, their bill's going to produce some $3+ trillion of debt compared to current law. But they have to do a 30-year estimate. Their bill's going to produce over $30 trillion in debt compared to current law. Because they're destroying that second pillar, no deficits after 10 years. And the third pillar was to use honesty in numbers. But folks on the other side of the aisle said, we're embarrassed by this massive debt-creating monster. But we want to pass it because it gives tax breaks to the richest Americans, and that's what we're all about. We're going to cut health care for 16 million Americans to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. We're going to leave 4 million children hungry to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. But that's a little embarrassing that we're also going to run up a massive debt of the United States of America to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. And you know what? That not only harms citizens today. I mean, citizens across this country, when they hear about this bill, they go, that's just wrong. It is absolutely wrong to destroy health care or housing or education in order to line the nest of the already best-off Americans. It's just wrong. What happened to government by and for the people? Why is the Republican Party pursuing government by and for the powerful, the richest? And that's where this nickname comes from for this bill, the big, beautiful betrayal. Why is it a betrayal? Because President Trump campaigned on helping families. But the moment that he was sworn into office, who was standing behind him? Was it champions for the people? Champions on health care? No. Champions on affordable housing? No. Champions on food programs or nutrition? No. Who was standing behind him? Billionaires. Billionaires were standing behind President Trump. And so it's a big, beautiful betrayal because he campaigned on helping families, but the bill he's championing instead hurts families and helps billionaires. Now, how is it that a law that's been in place for now 51 years can be corrupted corrupted to allow deficits beyond year 10? How is it that a law that's been in place for 51 years can be corrupted to stop using the honest numbers that come evaluating the cost or the revenue impact of each and every provision? How is that possible? Well, I'll tell you how that's possible. And that's the chair of the Budget Committee said, hey, there's this provision, wasn't designed for reconciliation, it was designed to help resolve technical anomalies in regular bills, not for reconciliation, for regular bills, but it gave the Budget Committee the ability to provide some flexibility about evaluating and solving technical anomalies. And so the chair of the Budget Committee has proposed taking that provision that is there in a section of the bill for regular budgeting that gives some flexibility to the Budget Committee to resolve anomalies and transporting it over into this other special filibuster-free pathway designed to decrease deficits to create a phony baseline. So instead of taking a provision in the proposed law and saying, well, this provision is here, how much cost would it add? Instead you say, well, let's take this provision and pretend that if it wasn't here, there'd be some other provision, maybe an extension of something that actually is expiring. So we'll create this phony numbers to try to pretend this doesn't create the debt it creates. So here we are, Section 312, the chair's authority on regular budgeting being transported into reconciliation. Now, stay with me here. This has never been used in this fashion because the entire law as written, the instructions for reconciliation say you have to cost out each provision. If the clause is in the proposal, what it would cost compared to the clause not being in the proposal. So here we are back in regular budgeting, this power that's in Section 312 for the chair, and actually it says the Budget Committee, not the chair, to resolve an anomaly. Has it ever before been used in a partisan fashion? No. Here are the times it's been used. Never before has it been a partisan thing. It's been Democrats and Republicans together saying we have a naughty little technical problem. For example, like a program that has a new name. Is that being costed as a new program, but it's actually an existing program, just has a new name? How do we resolve that? That type of little technical difficulty. Always done, worked out, used in a bipartisan fashion. Again, power that was assigned to the committee, not to the chair. How else does 312 differ in the past from the present? Well, it's never been used on a broad bill. It's been used to resolve individual, small, narrow issues. Things like the Crime Victims Fund, things like the Power Marketing Administration, things like double counting of a dairy program, little narrow provisions, not on a systematic bill-wide basis, not at all, no. Never done. Again, only in a bipartisan fashion on very narrow provisions. And how else does it differ? Well, it's always been used to resolve this technical ambiguity challenge, some little anomaly that occurs in a bipartisan fashion on a narrow bill. But here, it's being used systematically across an entire bill to create a fake baseline to pretend that those provisions that cost money don't actually cost money, because instead of comparing that provision to the provision not being in the law, we'll compare it to pretending the provision would have been in the law even if we didn't put it into the law. That is as phony as it could possibly get. Destroys integrity completely. And has it ever been used in a reconciliation bill? No. Because there's special instructions for the reconciliation bill. They're laid out in Section 310 and 313. 312, regular budgeting, power to the budget committee, not the chair, but to the committee, to resolve ambiguities. And finally, let's just look at the type of money that was associated with these narrow programs. Crime Victims Fund, $73 million, sounds like a lot. The largest provision it's ever been used for is adjustments in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, again in a bipartisan basis, on a contained program, $2.8 billion. Well, what are we talking about now? We are talking about trying to hide $37 trillion in debt, new debt. Wow. So, to every colleague on either side of the aisle who has back home said, we need to get our deficit under control, this is not the bill for you. This bill creates over $3 trillion in debt compared to current law over just a 10-year period. Now, our debt is already over 100% of our GDP. I talked to a number of colleagues, and they said, well, we got to hold it to 100% of GDP. We're already at like 120%, meaning the debt is in the high 30s, about $36.5 trillion. And our gross domestic product, our entire economy, everything it creates in a single year, is about $28 trillion. So the debt is now much larger than everything our economy produces in a single year. That's the danger zone, folks, because you start to enter a debt vortex. And the debt vortex means the debt's gotten so high that the interest rates are starting to eat up the budget. So to fund our military security and our basic health care, housing, and education programs, well, we have to borrow more money. And that's what this bill does. It borrows, 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 as far as the eye can see. So, again, colleagues on both sides of the aisle, my Democratic colleagues, my Republican colleagues, if you've ever said a word about fiscal responsibility, do not accept this corruption of allowing a provision to be used to create a fake baseline. We solved that together, 100 senators. We solved it 51 years ago by creating CBO, Congressional Budget Office, to give us honest, nonpartisan estimates. Don't create phony baselines. In the future, which other party? Maybe it'll be this side of the aisle that wants to use a phony baseline. We agreed together not to do this. This was not just a handshake. This was a vote. This is the law. Do not corrupt it. And work with us for a different vision, not a vision of families lose, because that's what happens in this bill. 16 million people losing health care, 4 million children going hungry. 2 fun tax breaks and giveaways for the richest Americans. That's not a vision. Join us and rewrite this bill. Let's reduce the deficit it creates. Let's reduce the total debt it creates. And certainly, let's not create provisions that allow there to be deficits beyond the 10-year window. Let's keep the honesty of using nonpartisan numbers, not phony baselines. Let's create the integrity of sticking with the no deficits after 10 years. Let's do that with the vision of families thriving and billionaires paying their fair share. Thank you, Madam President.